Our next speaker this evening is Professor Piers Robinson of the University of Sheffield, where he is Chair of Politics, Society and Political Journalism. Professor Robinson regularly gives his expert opinion on television and has published numerous academic articles, including a treatise on the Chilcot Report. Furthermore, he has also written a published book entitled The Handbook of Media, Conflict and Security. Tonight, Piers will discuss propaganda, deception and the war on terror from 9/11 to Syria. So let's welcome Professor Piers Robinson.
Oh, it's okay. I'll hold the mic. It's less comfortable doing it this way. But okay, thank you very much for that introduction. What I thought I would do tonight, over about 15-20 minutes, is to run through a number of areas which I think are going to be useful to give a little bit of context, or a broader sort of theoretical context for understanding why we have media failure, why the media doesn't seem to do the job that it's expected to do. A little bit higher. Okay. So I'm not used to using a mic. So what I was going to do, I was going to sort of break the talk into three sections. First of all, I'll talk a little bit about some of the arguments and accounts which try to explain the way the media operates, and try and give a little bit of an understanding as to why media failure occurs and why we have the kind of problems with misrepresentation and distortion of issues that we seem to have in cases such as Syria. I'll do that fairly rapidly, and then I want to move into talking more generally about propaganda. And I appreciate with the audience here and the interest you will have. I might be teaching grandma to suck eggs on this one. But I want to talk a little bit about the problem of propaganda and a little bit about the way in which understanding and awareness of propaganda has really been sort of removed and pulled out of society and our awareness. And then I want to talk a little bit about why governments engage in propaganda, and I want to talk a little bit about the kind of scale of the problem that I think we confront in terms of propaganda in contemporary liberal democracies. And then in the third section, really sort of, I guess this is going to be the core of it, I want to talk through recent research findings which I've been disseminating and publishing in relation to the war on terror, in relation to what the Chilcot Report, which published in June of this year, offered up in terms of providing understanding not just of the invasion of Iraq and the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, but also a much broader context of the origins of the war on terror and the kind of planning that was going on. And in going through that material, what I hope to do, in the same way I want to give a bit of broader context in terms of understanding propaganda in the media, hopefully in terms of the content of the other presentations and the focus in particular that we have in Syria, I want to try and start to give a sense of the broader picture which now appears to be emerging in terms of precisely the kind of geopolitical conflict that we have become involved in, quite how serious that is, and quite how deep and wide-ranging it is. So those are the areas I want to cover today. First of all, talking a little bit about the media, talking a little bit about why the media fails. Now, for a lot of academics who study media or who study political communication, there's a fairly well-established understanding of why the media operates in the way that it does, and why the media doesn't operate, or sorry, why the media doesn't fulfill its democratic watchdog function. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with this work, but for those of you who are not, I recommend you go and have a look at the work of Herman and Chomsky, look at their book Manufacturing Consent and their propaganda model of the mass media, because it gives a very good introduction, broad overview of the major constraints which act upon the media within a liberal democracy. And you can see that, I don't really want to go into great detail on each of these filters, but you can see these, what Herman and Chomsky describe as filters, as forces or factors which act upon the media and which stop them from really doing their job of holding power to account. And Herman and Chomsky point out, well, you have the issue of the size and concentration of the mass media, its profit orientation, and that immediately means that for a lot of the mainstream mass media in the West, they're dominated by big business, and that produces a structural, institutional constraint on their ability to ask serious questions of those power blocks within society. Reliance upon advertising has its impact on the kind of news agenda, the risk-averse nature of advertisers, not wanting overly critical news stories to interrupt the buying mood and so on. All of these things factor into news production. I'll come back to a reliance upon official sources in a second. Herman and Chomsky also talk about flat. They talk about the kind of criticism which gets delivered at the media when they might, on occasion, actually start to ask fundamentally challenging questions of government and of power, and the kind of disciplining effect flack and attacks can have on journalists and editors. They also talk, writing in the context of the Cold War, they talk about the ideology of anti-communism, creating an ideological bond between journalists and policymakers. And Herman argues that really these constraints are still in play today. You have a neoliberal consensus, ideological consensus, which dominates and shapes how journalists understand and approach issues. Other people talk about the war on terror, and I'll get to this at the end of the talk, but talk about the war on terror as performing similar ideological functions in terms of creating a sort of unified worldview between policymakers and journalists. But the most important thing, and this is the thing I want to concentrate on, so this will use this to segue into a discussion about propaganda, is that Herman and Chomsky argue if you look at the way journalists operate and you look at their sort of standard sort of operating mode is to defer to and use official sources, political elites when constructing the news agenda. And this is actually one of the most well-established facts within political communication science. That if you look and analyse news broadcasters and you look at the kind of sources which they use, they predominantly use official sources. And this means that, and this is at the heart, I think, of starting to understand why we have the kind of media failure that we have in contemporary liberal democracies, is that this reliance upon official sources makes journalists acutely vulnerable to propagating propaganda, to relaying official propaganda. Okay, and that's the sort of a very important thing as the first port of call in terms of understanding the kind of problem that we have. If journalists are deferring to official sources to the extent that they are, then the tendency for them to absorb and to replicate and to reinforce propaganda campaigns coming from the government becomes very, very powerful. Now, what is propaganda? Okay, I want to talk for 5 or 6 minutes about propaganda. Propaganda is, the way I would define it, it's a form of persuasive communication. It's a coordinated approach to persuading, influencing beliefs and conduct. It's not just about getting people to think in a particular way, it's also about getting people to act in a particular way. And while saying some academics like to describe any form of persuasion as propaganda and so on, I don't think that's really a very accurate analysis of how a term's been used, certainly in the last 100 years. Propaganda is essentially involves a non-consensual process. It's not a two-way process of persuasion between two, as it were, mutually consenting people who are trying to understand an issue. It's a process in which there is a manipulation which violates rational will or free will. People are co-opted or pushed into thinking or acting in particular ways which they wouldn't otherwise do if they hadn't been subjected to the propaganda. So this is primarily about manipulation. It's about manipulating people's minds and manipulating people's behaviour. Now, of course, when we use the term propaganda, and when we then say, well, we're talking about manipulation, etc., the first thing which comes to the mind of many people is that, well, we think of propaganda as something which happened back there in the Second World War, or it's something which happens in non-liberal democracies, and the kind of image you have there of World War I anti-German propaganda, that's the sort of image which comes to many people's minds when they hear the word propaganda. Perhaps not for all of you in this audience, but certainly more generally amongst the population. But of course, as we're all aware, so in some ways or on some levels, we are subjected to persuasion campaigns. We are subjected continually to attempts to manipulate the way we think and the way we understand issues. Here you've got an example from, of course you don't get these advertising in the UK because there's a ban on tobacco advertising, but this is from a campaign which was run in Berlin a few years ago. We've got a piece of propaganda there trying to persuade people to smoke Marlboro cigarettes and creating association with love and passion. Outside of the commercial sector, we have political propaganda, and this is, for those of you as Germans and up to scratch, Guten Heimflug is Good Flight Home, clearly a political poster by a far-right paper playing upon Islamophobic sentiments. and so on, a piece of contemporary propaganda. Emotive, playing upon Islamophobia, and here, of course, familiar, I'm sure, to some of you, the kind of sort of rational propaganda that we had in the run-up to the Iraq War, which I'll talk a little bit about later on into the presentation. But the manipulation of information and intelligence reports in order to exaggerate the threat posed by Iraq's alleged WMD, leading to these kind of 45 minutes from doom. So we are surrounded by propaganda. A lot of people do recognise that. Not everybody, many people see it as something which is consigned to history, or as something which non-democratic states engage in. But to a very large extent, there is a lack of awareness that we do live in a highly propagandised society. And this is no accident that this is the case. This is a very quick quote which I'll run through from Edward Bernays, considered by many as the founding father of public relations. The term propaganda got to be a bad word, says Eddie Bernays, because of the way the Germans used it in the First World War. So we had to come up with a new word to describe these activities of manipulation, of manipulative persuasion. And so we came up with the term Council on Public Relations. And there was born PR. Okay. And of course, this has spawned over time a powerful euphemism industry. Is that when Western governments engage in propaganda, of course they don't call it propaganda, because they know that people understand that that means some kind of manipulation. So we have a vast array of terms, and the list is much longer than that, but this gives you a good idea. Political marketing, promotional culture, public diplomacy, public relations, psychological operations, strategic communication, perception management, political communication. It goes on and on and on. But these are all terms used to essentially describe the kind of activities which historically were described as propaganda, and which, although not all of the time, for a very large part of the time, do involve manipulation. And there's a great quote there from the wonderfully titled book, Taking the Risk Out of Democracy, by Carey, that the success of business propaganda in persuading us that we are free from propaganda is one of the most significant achievements of the 20th century. So we live in a highly propagandized society. Why do governments engage in this? And I want to start getting closer to the kind of territory of discussion that most of the other presenters have today, which is the current conflict and war in Syria. And I want to run through very rapidly, and I do recommend that you read John Mearsheimer's book, Deception and Lying in Politics, Why Leaders Lie, because he's a realist, he's a very prominent American realist academic, and he's got a certain kind of honesty about the way he talks about what's going on in the world. But he argues that from a realist point of view, from a kind of a foreign policy angle point of view, deception and the associated propaganda with that is often seen as a strategic necessity. It's required to engage in propaganda in order to pursue and to protect the national interests. And this is a mindset, a belief which is held by many people within the foreign policy establishment. Mearsheimer makes a wonderfully counterintuitive point that liberal states actually, or states actually tend to deceive their populations more often than they deceive each other in the international system. States rarely lie to each other because they have intelligence services which can detect that, but they will frequently lie to their own populations. And there's a very elitist kind of underpinning to this, which is foreign policy formulation should really be the preserve of elites, that they are the people who are best placed to decide what should be done. And these are the kind of arguments, this is what one is up against, okay, and what the media is up against, and what we're all up against in terms of dealing with propaganda coming from governments, is that we have a mindset, certainly within a foreign policy community, that deception and manipulation of public opinion is an acceptable and necessary thing to engage in. So they don't have any problem with what they're doing to a very large extent. And there's an ideological underpinning, and I'm conscious of time, but there's a wonderful little quote there from the neoconservative Irving Kristol about this attitude about sort of the need to manipulate minds, and I won't read through the quote because I don't have time, but you can return to it and look at it. But talking about there are truths for the sophisticated, there are truths for the ruling class, and there are truths for the workers and the masses and so on, and these aren't all the same thing and so on. So we're really harking back to the notion of Plato's noble lie and so on. And again, that's a mindset shared by many people within elite establishments across the West. It's not across the board, but by many people. So this kind of attitude, this kind of mindset underpins the use and the application of propaganda. Many propaganda strategies, which I'll have to talk through fairly quickly. Lying is the most ineffective form of sort of engaging in propaganda, in the sense that, as a German proverb said, lies have short legs. The political cost associated with being caught out on a lie is very, very high. So really, a lot of propaganda involves more subtle forms of deception, distorting information, firming up the evidence on WMD in Iraq, omission of information, getting inconvenient information out of the public realm, misdirection, I've got a little quote there, to Russiagate, pushing people's attention away to other issues to distract them from core issues which are going on within a country, for example. And also strategies involving incentivization. Sanctions have been mentioned already today. These, and also sort of coercive communication processes, all of these can be understood as forms of propaganda, trying to fearmonger, for example, in the case of coercion. With sanctions, it's a form of incentivization, a communicative incentivization, in order to get people to behave differently or to act in a different way. And this is the kind of sum of the array of techniques which are used in terms of propaganda. I have to skip through that. How and where is it produced? Okay, many people, when they think of propaganda, they think of, well, this is PR campaigns, linguistic, spoken, visual communication. For sure, that's a big part of propaganda. Propaganda also involves, and this is coming up in some of the presentations, it also involves control or influence over the production of knowledge. Academia, journalists, think tanks, NGOs such as Amnesty and MSF can all get caught up in production of knowledge, which is about trying to shape people's understandings and opinions, and can be understood as part of propaganda. And propaganda also involves action in the real world. It involves doing things. So the examples I put up there is the shock and awe strategy in Iraq, the dramatic high-profile bombing of government buildings in Iraq, was primarily there to send a coercive message to the Iraqi population to bow down and comply. Don't try to resist. The white helmets, which I think Vanessa will be talking about, the white helmets is a very clear example of an entity created for propaganda purposes and so on. So propaganda is not just about messaging, it's also about action in the real world. Very important to keep that in mind. Now I want to talk in the 5 or 6 minutes I have is to talk through recent research findings regarding the war on terror. And there is a series of publications which have recently come out, which people are free to look into the details if they want to sort of look into the details of the research which I've been doing and so on, and look at a broader base of evidence. But this essentially, I've been sort of for many years looking at the run-up to the Iraq War, and I was looking at deception and WMD, and the Chilcot report, which reported in June of this year, or July, confirmed pretty much the kind of manipulation over WMD intelligence that many people had suspected. This, I posit to everybody, is actually the small story which emerges out of the Chilcot report, the sort of the confirmation of it, manipulation of intelligence. The really interesting stuff which comes out of Chilcot is in section 3.1, and it's material which refers to the formative stages of the war on terror. And so what you have, and this is actually, in terms of the way Chilcot was presented to the British public, and in a sense, in the way it was spun, really managed to completely ignore this critical part of the report, which actually gives us a really strong handle on the genesis of the war on terror, what it was about, and also starts to give us some indications of how we got to where we are today. Now, just some quotes in here. This is a British Embassy cable from 4 days after 9/11, stating that the regime change hawks in Washington are planning on using a war on terrorism to clear up other problems in the region. So you immediately have there an indication that the war on terror is about more than simply combating Al-Qaeda and so on. It's about exploiting that event for geopolitical motivations. Interesting conversation, that's an excerpt from an email between Tony Blair and, well, not an email, a memo between Tony Blair and George Bush, talking fairly sort of in a relaxed way about when they were going to go for Saddam Hussein. Again, this is immediately after 9/11. And Blair cautioning, well, we know what you want to do Saddam, but we need to do that further down the line and so on. And as we know, they ultimately decided to invade Afghanistan first. These are some of the conversations which Blair was having with George Bush about how to perhaps remove Saddam Hussein without a full-blown invasion, supporting opposition groups, covert operations, destabilizing, and then when rebellions occur, go in and support those rebellions. And there's an indicator there, I think, for what we've seen in Syria over the last 5 or 6 years. Again, these are the plans circulating and discussions being had immediately after 9/11 between Bush and Blair. And it gets more interesting and it gets more damning. This is a conversation where Blair is saying, look, if toppling Saddam is our prime objective, it's easier to do it with Syria and Iran in favour or acquiescing rather than hitting all three at once. So obviously the conversation going on there is that when are they going to take out these three countries? When are they going to hit Iran? When are they going to hit Syria? And Blair saying we need to do Iraq first and then come back to Syria possibly at a later point, or Iran at a later point. Very quickly, a little line there about sort of Tony Blair talking about the need for a tight-knit propaganda campaign, just reinforcing this point that sort of internally, in a private level, politicians, foreign policy elites use the term propaganda, etc. They won't use it in public, obviously, but in private they do. What does this all mean? What are the implications of this? Well, the number one implication is that I would suggest, and I put forward, and these are the arguments which I'm making in academic papers, is essentially we have a confirmation now from Chilcot of Wesley Clark's remarkable claims, which I want to play.
10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
Confirmation of what Wesley Clark, former US military commander, stated about what he observed immediately after 9/11, that this was a series of regime change operations which were initiated to taking advantage of 9/11 in order to achieve them. There's a second little nugget here of information which comes out of Chilcot, and again, this is a memo between Tony Blair, and they're talking about, it's in a document called Phase 2 of the War on Terror. There are 7 countries listed in this document, and it gets to this stage where Tony Blair raises this point, says, "I'm sorry to be a bore on this, the Middle East is set for catastrophe." Okay, and this is immediately after 9/11. This is before the invasion of Afghanistan, before the invasion of Iraq, and Blair is stating quite clearly there's this indication here that he's aware of something very big which is about to happen in the Middle East. Something very big which obviously has been happening for the last 15 years. And it's interesting, that little bit of information in that document between Tony Blair, because it does actually corroborate something which Sir Richard Dealer, former head of MI6, came out and publicly said 2 years ago about a conversation he had with Prince Bandar, and I'll quickly play this.
Allow me to recount 2 anecdotes about Saudi Arabia. And I think this is the country to which we should always look first in trying to interpret the current agonistes of Islam. Shortly after 9/11, I was visiting Riyadh with the Prime Minister, and I remember the then head of the GID literally shouting at me across his office, "9/11 is a mere pinprick on the West. In the medium term, it's nothing more for you than a series of personal tragedies. What these terrorists want is to destroy the House of Saud and to remake the Middle East." The second Saudi incident predates 9/11 and comes from a conversation with Prince Bandar now, I believe at the moment, the titular head of the GID in Saudi Arabia. And that was, the time is not far off, Richard, in the Middle East, when it will be literally God help the Shia. More than 1 billion Sunnis have simply had enough of them. And that was a chilling comment, which I remember very well indeed.
Okay, well, I'm also time I need to wrap up. I mean, it is very significant that you have Sir Richard Dearlove, former head of MI6, making those kind of statements in public 2 years ago, and gives you a very clear indication of the kind of backdrop of the scale of the conflict which we're involved in. To wrap up and just to conclude, propaganda is extensive in contemporary liberal democracies and a very big problem. Many would argue, and I would argue, that there is a permanent and significant displacement of reality because of these propaganda activities, and this has become very clear in the case of Syria. In terms of the war on terror, in terms of the evidence we have from Chilcot and from claims Wesley Clark, etc., we clearly have a geostrategic agenda, probably based around resources and influence. It's probably a strategic alliance that we have with Israel, the Gulf states, etc., and Saudi Arabia in particular. A war, a conflict which is based upon multiple regime change operations and about exploiting the threat of terrorism in order to enable those operations. So what I put forward to you at the end is that the war on terror itself can be understood as a kind of propaganda campaign in order to realise this much broader geopolitical project which we have been witnessing for the last 15 years. Thank you.